Hello, and welcome to the Christian Habits Podcast. This is the podcast that will help you break free from your strongholds, draw closer to God, and develop habits that will help you love God and others better. And now, here's your host, Barb Raveling.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. It's so good to have all of you here. And I am excited today to have Andrea Herzer with me. And she is the author of Incurable Faith, 120 Devotions of Lasting Hope for Lingering Health Issues. And so if you are a person who struggles with chronic pain or a disease or some chronic health problems, or if one of your loved ones is struggling with one of those things, or you're a caregiver, or you have a friend that's just, having some troubles, this is going to be a good podcast for you to listen to. Andrea is intimately acquainted with hardships, the company debilitating health issues, because she spent the last 20 years with multiple illnesses, including CRPS and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So navigating life while undergoing infusions, chemotherapy, more than 100 surgical procedures, and all the complications in between have given her a deep compassion for those who also suffer. And over the last 2 decades, she wrote her book that's coming out in June 20th, 23. And anyway, that's just this incredible book with lots of devotions and all kinds of different topics that people who are dealing with pain and suffering and health issues would like to read through. So welcome to the podcast, Andrea. It's good to have you here.
Thanks, Barb. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Good. And I know that when we were talking beforehand, Andrea said she's having a hard day with pain and with asthma. So we're just going to plow through and see how it goes. So we're just glad to have you here. Why don't you start by just telling us a little bit about you, Andrea?
All right. I am a wife and mother of 3 adult children. I live in Texas, but I am originally from Florida, and a lot of people don't know that about me. I am a beach girl at heart, but right now I'm just content to use the therapy pool in my backyard.
So you went from one warm state to another.
Yes, I did.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your personal story and your purpose for writing your devotional, Incurable Faith?
Yes, I'd love to share about that. Over 20 years ago, after the birth of our 3rd child, chronic pain and illness changed my life. I went from being active in ministry, Bible studies, moms of preschoolers, volunteering at my children's school, which was just a joy and a passion for me because I love to be involved as a mom and I love to be active in my community. But I went from all of that to barely being able to get out of bed. And some days I couldn't get out of bed at all. I was in excruciating pain. I was diagnosed with a number of different chronic health issues. And as I searched for solutions, and you mentioned it in the intro, I've been through a lot of surgical procedures and I've tried everything from acupuncture to massage to spinal cord stimulator and you name it. But I finally learned that an unhealthy fixation with my broken body will only break me further because I wasn't living an abundant life. And I knew that Jesus gives us abundance, but I was hopeless and I was fearful and anxious. And I know I'm not alone. Many of us, when we are faced with a chronic, unabating, lingering illness, especially one that involves pain, it can affect our walk with the Lord. It can affect our spiritual lives. So I searched for a biblical guidebook to help me live well, even if I never felt well. And as I began to discover practical tools and biblical wisdom, it was natural to begin writing down those lessons for others. So I knew I wasn't alone. I would meet so many people at surgery centers and pain support groups and during chemotherapy that wanted kind of insider advice. They wanted to know, how have you gone through this and you still have joy? They were facing similar battles and they wanted encouragement. So I would hand out the devotions, or I'd maybe just speak the truths that I'd been learning to them. And people would tell me, you need to write a book, put this all down into a book. Well, after filling up about 12 journals full of my devotions and scriptures and things that had brought me joy and encouragement, I found myself in the ICU with a port infection, and my body was going into shock. So I prayed, Lord, please help me to live and finish this work you've put on my heart. Help me to finish this book. And it's a miracle that I lived, but here's another miracle. 7 years to the day that I left that hospital, Incurable Faith is being published.
That's incredible. I mean, and 7 years, that's a long time to write a book, but in that 7 years, you had a lot going on, and I'm sure it's just so hard, many days to write. So one of the things, if I think about, what would happen if I had, just a really bad diagnosis, I feel like one of the things I would jump to first is worst case scenario. I would just start worrying about it. So how did you deal? Did you struggle with that? Did you jump to worst case scenario? Did you start worrying? How did you deal with that?
It's almost like you know me. Yes, absolutely. I did that. And I think especially in this day and age, many years ago, people would just trust their doctor's advice. Now we find out we have a diagnosis or our loved one has a diagnosis, and we immediately start Googling and we start researching, and we want to know all the answers. And I certainly did that. But what I have learned through years of medical complications and pain and 2 bouts with cancer and all of the hardships that pain and chronic illness have brought into my life, what I've learned is that when our thoughts are filled with trepidation about the future, they leave no room to consider God's sufficiency for the future. Because the truth is that feeding your thoughts on worst case scenarios will never prepare your spirit to endure suffering. And sometimes things that I worried about really did come true. They really did happen. And maybe they happened worse than what I had ever imagined. But I found God's amazing and miraculous grace in those circumstances. I found his presence in the pain, and he has used those times to transform me and to transform my family for good.
Yeah, I remember somebody saying, God gives you grace when you need it. He doesn't give it to you before, but he gives you grace when you need it. So what did that look like on a practical level? Like, did you have to do anything to make that happen?
Well, I'll give you one example. When I was in that ICU, the Lord gave me a strong, faith-filled, believing nurse who would whisper in my ear, don't give up. The enemy would want you to give up and give in, but the Lord has a plan for you, and you need to keep fighting and hold on to the promises of God. And she would just whisper these things in my ear to encourage me. Now that's the grace of God. I've been in the hospital. I can't even count how many times I've been in the hospital. And at my lowest point, God sent someone to bring me that depth of encouragement when I needed it the most. And that's just one example. I have many.
Wow, that's really neat. Did you have any special Bible verses that you meditated on or anything like that that really helped you and gave you strength during those times?
Well, I have a few, actually. One of them is, and it's one of my favorite verses, is 2 Corinthians 12:9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And also, I think about Psalm, I think it's 73:26. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. And one that a friend of mine actually made a little booklet for me. And so I have pictures, and I think I've put them up on my Instagram, but I have pictures of me going through chemo, holding this book that says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Oh, yeah. So what did you just like kind of lay there and meditate on them, think about them, repeat them, or what did that process look like to get those Bible verses into your heart and bring peace through them?
Well, the truth is that I had stored up years of truth before I ever got sick. And I knew scripture very diligently. Every single day, I spend time in God's word. I look up the Greek terms. I look up the Hebrew. I try and really dive deeply because it is nourishment to my soul. There's a verse that says, "These are not idle words for you. They are your life." And I found that to be true. But I'll be honest, when we are in a situation where maybe for me with having blood cancer, my blood levels would be too low, my hematocrit, my white blood cells, and it affects your thoughts. It really does. You can't help but be changed when your body is not, your chemistry is not working as it should. And so there have been times when I can't even think of a verse. It doesn't even come to me. And it's very few and far between. But that's where it's important to have others around you that you've cultivated relationships with that are believing Christians that can speak truth into your life and encourage you and support you when you just don't even know where to go.
That's good. And really your book, in some ways, you're that encouraging Christians for others because you've written over the years while you've been experiencing all those things. And one thing I like about the book is I really like your table of contents because she'll have different, like I think one of them's called like a worst case scenario or so. So she'll have different headings where you can say, oh yeah, that's what I'm experiencing today. And then you can choose one. So I like that about the book.
Let me share one. Speaking of, there's one called The Destination Will Be Worth It. And this, I think, is something that we need to remember, that this is not our home. And what God is doing in us and through us now is that our light and momentary afflictions, and they don't feel light and they don't feel momentary, but God's word says that they are. So we walk by faith and not by sight. Our light and momentary afflictions are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. And so I've written a devotion where I talk about going to visit Hawaii. And in all my fantasies about visiting Hawaii, I never envisioned how long it would take to get there and how much pain I would be in sitting in an airplane. And but after a day of rest, after having endured the trip, I felt like a child again as the buoyancy of the ocean helped relieve my pain. And I realized that paradise is the final destination for those of us who trust Jesus, but suffering can block our perspective so we lose sight of hope. And then I muse about, what if I decided that Hawaii couldn't possibly exist because the journey to get there was just too difficult? And that's what we do when we allow our hardships to destroy our faith in God's promises. And what if I believed I'd never leave that stuffy airplane cabin? But that's what we do when we decide our trials will never end. An eternal perspective gives us the hope we need to continue the journey. And I have found that to be absolutely true in my life.
Oh yeah, that's really good. Was that one of the little devotionals in your book that you just read? Yeah.
I was referring to it. Yes.
Yeah. That's good. I can see how that'd be really helpful. I imagine that through this time, God has really taught you a lot of lessons. Do you feel like you've learned a lot of lessons and grown as a Christian during this time?
I have. When I first got sick, it was my belief, and I still believe that God can heal me at any moment. And I've certainly experienced many different forms of healing in my life. But I believed that I would just get better and I would go right back to living my life as an physically active wife and mom. But that didn't happen. And when my prayers seemed as though they were being unanswered, and they weren't being unanswered. It just seemed that way because they weren't being answered in the way that I would have chosen. I started questioning, is God listening to me? Doesn't he know I could serve him better if I could be active? I could be involved in the ministries I used to do. And I started lamenting because I was just crying out to God, why are you allowing this in my life? I don't need this level of pruning. But I realized that the master gardener knows exactly how much pruning to allow so that we will be fruitful in him. And I was just reading this morning in Hebrews, where it talks about that we're to consider hardship as discipline, and that the Lord's discipline is so that we can share in his holiness, and it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who are trained by it. And I look at these decades with health issues and all of the things that I had written, and how this is becoming now a book, Incurable Faith, for other people. And I see this beautiful harvest out of it. And it's just amazes me at God's redemptive character.
Oh yeah, I love that. It's like we hate suffering. We don't want us suffering, but the lessons that comes out of it, and the intimacy with God that comes out of it, if we turn to him for help rather than other things, they don't maybe make it worth it most of the time, or depends on how hard the trial is, but you feel like almost worth it. I don't know.
Well, and I think about that verse that says it might be Romans 8:18, but our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that'll be revealed in us. So sometimes we don't understand, and we don't always get to see how God is redeeming our suffering. And if we look at Hebrews chapter 11, we see that many of God's followers did not get to see. They only welcomed their hope from a distance. Oh, yeah. And so that's walking by faith.
That's good. In fact, it reminds me, I was just listening to a Timothy Keller sermon on suffering, which is incredible. And I'll put it in the show notes, a link to it. And he talked about how, a lot of times with disease, we ask why, we don't always know. And sometimes we have to be content not knowing. And also you brought up lamenting. Do you talk about lamenting in your new book?
I do. I actually encourage people to write out their own lament. And I mention Habakkuk and Jeremiah, that they lamented their circumstances and their situations. But the beautiful thing about lamenting, which is really just giving voice to our complaints, lament is an act of worship. And it's the process from which we move through our pain of the difficult circumstances into restored hope in God's promises. And in the book, I talk about how both prophets ended their lament with the word yet. So it's like the bud isn't blooming, and the olive trees aren't in bloom, and all of these things are happening. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord my God. And when you're in the middle of the lament, before you can turn and say, yet, I know my God's character, I know that he's faithful, that's the bridge. That word yet is the bridge that brings us back to hope.
Right. So we have to remember who God is in the midst of it, and maybe also remember what he's done in the past, different ways he's uplifted us and helped us through hard times in the past. I would think that would be helpful too. And also another resource that Andrea sent me this yesterday, because I really haven't tried this lamenting yet, and I'm interested in. So she wrote a blog post about it that really shows you how to do it. And I'll include that link in the show notes too. I thought that was super helpful. So the lamenting, it sounds like it leads us towards remembering who God is, how faithful he is, how he's helped us in the past. What do you do with contentment? Because I think that'd be another thing I'd struggle with is, contentment, not being able to do as much as you want to do, and maybe just the hassle factor and all the medical things, maybe seeing all your friends out there doing things. You're sitting in in your house, not being able to go out. How do you handle the contentment and find joy in the midst of a life you don't really want to be living?
Oh, I talk about that a lot in the book because that's something that I face all the time. And I think even those of us who are healthy face that comparison. And but I found, firstly, that God brings healing contentment to my soul when I focus on his character instead of the characteristics of my illness. And there's actually a story that I tell, and this is, I don't know, it's kind of funny, I think, but it's called Flying into Freedom. And it's one of the devotions where during one of our Texas summers, we have so many bugs. And one of my children, who shall remain nameless, left the door open and an entire bounty of insects flew into our house. Well, I do my quiet times and writing and reading the Bible in my front room. And one of those pesky flies ended up between the shutters and the window pane. And that fly for, that evening and then into the next day was buzzing at that window pane. And it just was throwing itself into the window pane. And I counted, there were 21 blinds that were open to the room. If that fly had just stopped trying to break through the window pane, it would have seen the freedom that was offered. So it was such a great analogy that I'm just like that fly when I try and break through the window pane of disease, and I try and do things that my body maybe doesn't want me to do, and then I end up discouraged and in more pain and in bed and fatigued. But when I ask the Lord to guide me and I ask him to show me the freedom and the way that he's made available to me, then I can enter into the life that he has for me. And my book is actually a beautiful fruit of that, because when I was homebound, and I've been homebound off and on for numerous years, and being homebound is extremely isolating. Mm-hmm. So, and my gifts are best used in fellowship with others. I love to encourage. I love to exhort. I like to, teach people. I was a teacher. My first career was as a first grade teacher. And so writing these devotions was a way to use the gifts that God's given me, because our gifts are irrevocable. Our gifts and our calling are irrevocable. And I talk about that too in the book, that I want to encourage people that you still have something to offer.
Yeah, really what I hear you saying is, even though your life is so hard, you are still living a life of service. And I feel like a lot of times when we focus on serving others, we end up more content than when we focus on ourselves and like, how am I going to have a great life?
It's true. And especially there is something very limiting that happens when you have chronic illness, in that your friends and loved ones will say, oh, no, don't worry about me. Just worry about yourself right now. You take care of you. And, I tried that for a lot of years and found that I became more myopic. I became more self-focused. And it almost gave carte blanche. I actually use that term in the book. It gave carte blanche to innate selfishness. Oh, and what I've found is when the Lord started showing me that I needed to look up from my lap when I'm in a medical office, and I need to pray for people there, and I need to pray for open opportunities to encourage them, to speak truth into their lives, to pray with them, have the courage to pray with them. It transformed my life with illness. It really did. And so I love that the Lord can use even the hardest things to develop a heart of ministry and service and love and compassion for others, because he is a compassionate God and he cares about us.
I love that. And your illness actually gives you a platform for reaching people you wouldn't have been able to reach without it. Sometimes people will say, oh, might try and comfort somebody who's suffering, but the person who's suffering is thinking, your life is so great. You know nothing about my life, but nobody can say that about your life because they know how hard you've suffered. So you do have an opportunity to speak to some people that others wouldn't.
Yes, I have a Facebook group that it's called Abundant Life for Abundant Illness. And I have learned so much from the beautiful people in that group who have suffered, probably some of them definitely beyond what I've even suffered. And it's been a supportive group, but it's also been a blessing to reach out to them and give them little bites of God's word and encourage them onward. And I think we see each other as examples, and it's been one of the greatest, highest blessings of my life that God has used the things that I've been through to help me to have his compassion for others.
I love that. And we'll include a link to that in the show
Okay.
notes in case anybody's listening would like to join that group. So what would you say to the person who is listening and they were just recently given a tough diagnosis? I mean, they can join your group. I think that'd be a great place to start. But is there any other advice you would give to them?
I would say that the Lord calls you his beloved, and he will never leave you or forsake you. Your health is not a barometer of God's favor or love for you. And oftentimes, I found that visible signs of illness can make us feel less than lovely because people perceive us differently. One of my devotions asks you to recognize defeating thoughts about your dignity and worth, and remember that your worth doesn't waver in God's eyes. So I'll tell you the story. When I was in my scooter, which thankfully, I'm in a season right now where I haven't had to use it very much. But when I was in my scooter and I was bald from chemo and overweight from the steroids that were keeping me alive, I had to stop and remember that those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. That's what the Bible tells us. And I'm going to remind you that you may feel ashamed of some of, especially more intimate health issues that maybe you don't even want to share with people because you feel so embarrassed by some of the things that they've done to your life, or maybe some of the treatments or catheters or whatever it is that you need to use. But I'm going to remind you that you're radiant. You're created with beauty, dignity, and worth that no disease can take away.
I love that. You've just given us so much help, so much encouragement, ideas, wisdom. And I know your book has a lot more. So where can people find you online?
They can find me on my website at Andrea Herzer, HERZER.com, and they can sign up to receive free devotions and prayers. And I also want to mention that there are resources for caregivers that relate to my book, Incurable Faith. And I've wanted to extend that to caregivers because it's a challenging role to play. My husband is my primary caregiver, and he actually cried when he read some of the book because of the descriptions I have of the journey through cancer centers and receiving a tough diagnosis. And I just want to remind caregivers that they're not alone, and they can also find comfort and connection in Incurable Faith. And I have a story. I sent the book to my pastor, and one of his assistants read it. She found the book and she read it, and she has taken the role as a caregiver to a family member. And she said that when she was reading the book, she felt like the Lord was embracing her, like she had just received a hug, and that it felt like a comforting friend was speaking directly to her. And that's my prayer. My prayer is that every reader comes away with a similar sense of being held by God and met by a compassionate friend who's experienced similar struggles.
Good. That's good. And you're that person. So if you guys are struggling with this or caring for somebody, or you have somebody you love that has a illness or anything, any health ongoing issues or pain, check the book out. Thank you so much for being on the podcast to let us hear about it and let us know about your book, Andrea.
Barb, it's been a joy. Thank you so much for having me today.
Okay. And thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope you have a good week, and I will talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Christian Habits Podcast. If you'd like more help with stopping and starting habits, check out Barb's blog at www.barbraveling.com.